This
on this
conference
page
will now be recorded.
Sorry, that the organizing group is very appreciative that all of you are taking the time to join this webinar today. The team that's been putting this together includes a list of names there, just in alphabetical order, because we've all had quite a bit of work put in between Josh Atwood at the Hawaii Invasive Species Council, Laura Brewington with the East-West Center, Jeff Burgett with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, myself, Christy Martin with the Coordinating Group on Alien Pest Species, and Darcy Yogi, the Pacific Island Climate Adaptation Science Center intern. I wanted to give a quick brief history, as this group actually convened in the summer of 2019 with a plan to host a forum at the Hawaii Conservation Conference to highlight research and knowledge around the nexus of invasive species and climate communities, and to discuss how we can better integrate and work together. Unfortunately, that forum was canceled, so we didn't get the opportunity to do that, but this group continued to meet to determine if invasive species and a climate community of practice was worth pursuing. So what you're seeing today is a result of those efforts. Laura Brewington is going to kick us off with a presentation and talk about the results of a survey we distributed late last year on this topic. We will also hear after that from a panel of local experts. And then we've invited Toni Morelli from the Northeast Regional Effort on Invasive Species and Climate Change Management, the RISCC, to share their path to establishing a meaningful community of practice and as a possible model for our efforts going forward. And we will follow up with the interactive discussions mediated by Jeff Burgett. So I did want to just mention a few logistical things. You are all muted. Please do not share your webcam, as we are saving that space for panelists and presenters. One way you could possibly view that is if you look at the top middle part of the screen, you should be able to select View Active Cameras so that the appropriate people will have their cameras turned on at the right time and you can see them. Please do not hold conversations in the chat box. We are going to hold a question and answer session for Laura Brewington after her presentation. And I just do want to thank you in advance for your patience and understanding for any technical glitches that may occur. There are quite a number of people on this webinar, and we're excited for the enthusiasm for this. Before I open it up to Laura to begin her presentation, I just wanted to check in with the organizers to see if there was anything I missed or anything else you wanted to add.
Okay. Hey, Heather, this is Christy Martin. Could I chime in with a thank you to Deanna Spooner, who tried to organize us in that early run. We just really appreciate her efforts. So mahalo.
Yeah, thank you, Christy, for that. This was started by Deanna Spooner, and we've kind of helped move it forward. Thanks. Okay, not hearing anything else, I'm just going to hand it over to Laura. Thank you, Laura.
Thanks, Heather. I'm going to quickly turn on my video so that everyone knows that I'm a real person, but then I'm going to turn it back off. So it's great to have you all here. As Heather mentioned, we've been working on this effort for a while. I'm going to be presenting the results from a survey that we conducted late last year and into early this year to try to get at the climate information needs of Hawaii's natural resource managers. So as Heather mentioned, this idea was actually launched in early 2019 as a session that Deanna Spooner had planned for the Hawaii Conservation Conference. We were not able to hold that session, but our goals were to better understand the priorities of invasive species managers in Hawaii in the context of climate change, and to improve how we collaborate and work with each other. Specifically, our goals for this survey were to begin developing or forming a working group that would focus on improving our knowledge about the interactions between invasive species and climate change, to identify the needs for information tools and research that link climate change with invasive species management. And lastly, what we wanted to do as we were designing this survey was to basically provide us with the background information leading up to a meeting in early 2020 between researchers and managers to start defining next steps for how to meet those needs. And as most of you know, we were not able to hold an in-person meeting, and so this webinar is our early attempt to try to meet this third goal. As far as the survey was concerned, we tried to keep it fairly short. Thank you so much for those of you who are on this call who responded to the survey. It was made up of 15 multiple choice and ranking questions, and we opened it back in December of 2019 and closed it at the end of January of this year. We contacted about 88 natural resource managers in Hawaii. We received 59 responses, so we've got a pretty good response rate. There are a lot more than 59 people on this call, so thank you for joining us. I hope that the next few slides as I go through these survey results will hold your interest. I know it's going to be a lot of data and information, but our goal with this presentation is to seed a question and answer session with our panel that's going to follow my presentation. So please bear with me for the next 15 minutes or so. Our survey first asked who our respondents were, specifically what type of institute or office you work in, and how long you've worked in natural resource management in Hawaii. And we found that most of our participants were federal or state agency folks. The vast majority worked for federal agencies, whereas academics, nonprofits, and members of the other category made up about 30% of respondents. We had very experienced managers respond to the survey, ranging in the number of years that they'd worked in management from 3 years all the way up to 70 years. That person is amazing. I don't know who you are, but if you're here, thank you for your service. And the average of natural resource management number of years of experience was 17 years. So very experienced professionals in our group of survey respondents. We asked people where they work, primarily within the region, and we found that the majority, about 50% of people, work either on the island of Hawaii specifically, or they work statewide. Individual islands such as Oahu, Kauai, also ranked quite high. There were a number, about 12% of people responded that they work in Papahanaumokuakea, the Marine National Monument. And only about 3% of people said that they had done some work in the US affiliated Pacific Islands. This question about management priority areas was open for participants could choose multiple different categories of response. And so what we found here was that most of our respondents, at least 75%, did some work in biodiversity and another 73% in endangered species management. Rare habitats ranked almost with 50% of respondents. We had far fewer people who responded that they worked in marine resources, agriculture, and game management. We wanted to gauge how concerned respondents were about climate change in terms of meeting their management objectives, and also how important considering climate change is in terms of accomplishing their management goals. So if you look at the graphic on the left, we asked people how concerned they were about how climate change could complicate invasive species management. And we found that 52% of respondents were very concerned about the impacts of climate change on invasive species management, and another 35% were concerned. And so there were very high levels of concern about the impacts of climate change here in Hawaii. On the right, there's sort of two questions here. The bar graphs that are on the top show how important managing invasive species is for accomplishing goals. And the bars on the bottom refer to how important considering climate change is in terms of accomplishing your goals. And we found that participants reported that considering climate change was very important, or at least important. And very few people responded that it was only somewhat important or not at all important. We found that respondents to our survey had a very high level of climate literacy. When asked to rank their knowledge or their use of the regional or state level climate information that's available, 40% responded that they used that information regularly in their work, which is incredible, and another 40% said that they used it once or twice. So most people, almost 80%, said that they use climate information regularly or at least occasionally. In the other category, we had people sort of anecdotally say, well, you know, I've seen impacts of climate change on impacts of native ecosystems, or I just went to a meeting on climate change. So there's a high level of at least awareness, if not actual use of climate information in natural resource management in Hawaii. We also wanted to ask people how often they used certain types of climate information to inform their management. And so the blue bars represent that a type of information resource is used frequently, green is occasional use, and orange represents not at all. And we asked people how often they use things like along the bottom here, peer-reviewed literature, technical reports, meetings and workshops, informal conversations, and listservs and websites. And what we found is that most people's information comes from informal conversations, sort of peer-to-peer sharing, rather than the published literature. Most people, at least occasionally, about 60% of people responded that they occasionally get information from meetings and workshops. But then there's another 22%, this orange bar all the way on the left, who don't refer to the peer-reviewed literature at all. Related to the previous question, we wanted to understand what kinds of tools people actually use and how satisfied they are with them. So this question asked, how satisfied are you with the quality, the number, and the relevance of the available products, such as reports, websites, or tools produced by climate change researchers or other institutes? And we found that participants were fairly satisfied with the quality. No one was very satisfied with the quality, with the number of products, or with the relevance of products. But we had, some sort of tepid responses, somewhat satisfied and satisfied with the quality and the relevance of products. But they were less satisfied with the number of products. And as you can see from these light blue bars all the way to the right of each category, there were a lot of people who didn't have an opinion or just don't know, which says to us that there needs to be better communication about what types of products are out there and where people can find them. We wanted to know how severely certain factors would limit people's ability to incorporate climate change information into management of invasive species, and how difficult managing invasive species actually is according to these types of limitations. So all the way on the bottom of this slide, you'll see the limitations, such as information availability or access to information, agency mandates, prioritization access, funding, and personnel. And on the top graphic represents how much those factors might limit your ability to manage invasive species. On the bottom, how much those factors would limit your ability to incorporate climate change into your management actions. And we found that for both, funding and personnel was always a limiting factor. Much more so a limiting factor for actual management of invasive species, but for both managing invasive species and incorporating climate change into your plans, funding and personnel ranked the highest across all of the factors. There were problems with information that seemed more serious when it came to incorporating climate change, and that gets back to a possible lack of access or understanding of or availability of tools that allow managers to better incorporate climate change into their management actions. We asked participants what kinds of climate information they would like to see. And these range, I'm just reading from top to bottom on this slide, to specific climate projections over a range of spatial scales, a better understanding of the uncertainty in projected future conditions of the climate, a better understanding of technical aspects of climate science, better access to climate science data, more information on the appropriateness of that data for particular applications, better communication of what information is and is not available, and lastly, a collaborative research project to help answer specific questions such as predicted impacts. And what we found was that by far, having climate projections over a range of relevant scales, having better communication of what's available and what's not, and collaborative research were at the top of people's priority lists. Respondents were less interested in technical understandings of climate science or access to the data itself. To get at the questions of scales, we also asked, at what temporal and spatial scales would you want your climate information in order to best manage your natural resources? So the rankings rank from the bottom as least important to the top as most important, and on the left, temporal scales. The most important temporal scales that respondents identified were in the 1 to 5 and 10 to 25 years or annually. So that's they were all quite close. So fairly short or near term timescales. Seasonality showed up sort of at the low end of the priority. But the lowest priority timescale was end of century. And I think many of people on the call who work here in Hawaii are aware that most of our climate projections that are available currently are only limited to end of century. And there are a number of efforts ongoing right now to generate climate projections at shorter timescales that are more relevant to these management priorities. On the right, the spatial scales also were quite variable, but what we see is sort of a trend of the smaller spatial scales being more important, the landscape or the watershed or the hukua, whereas island, state, and region ranked far least important. We asked people to rate how different climate research related topics would rank in terms of importance for prioritizing management actions. And so some of the topics that we posed for respondents to react to were resilience of native communities, range shifting species, and hotspots of future invasion under climate change, biocontrol efficacy, the impacts of changes in wet and dry seasons, sleeper species, changing invasive species impacts, new pathways of introduction, and changes in extreme events. And what we found here is that native community resilience, range shifting species, and hotspots of future invasion and changing extreme events were respondents' highest priorities in terms of the climate research that they would like to see conducted that's relevant to their work. Whereas sleeper species and biocontrol ranked as much lower priorities. So to quickly conclude, before we move on to our panel discussion, I first again want to thank everyone who's on this call who responded to the survey. We couldn't have gleaned all of this great information without your time and your effort. We found overall that managers are very highly concerned about the impacts of climate change on invasive species management here in Hawaii, and that they have a high climate literacy. And the information is primarily transferred from person to person through informal conversations rather than through the published literature. That tells us that there's a need for more specific information, and managers identified a need for more products and more tools, especially at those smaller temporal and spatial scales, so shorter timeframes and smaller areas of focus. There is a need for more invasive species applications of the climate projections, so tailored research, like in one of the previous slides, in particular on native community resilience and range shifting species or future hotspots. It was clear that better communication is needed between climate information producers and managers about what tools and what products are actually available to them. And this is something that people want more than more technical climate talks or raw data access. And lastly, we're curious to know, is there an interest in a more broad Pacific regional focus? This particular survey only targeted managers that were based in Hawaii, but if we do grow into a broader working group, is there an interest in expanding it to encompass more of the Pacific? So that is all I have running through the survey results, and I am going to turn the mic over to Jeff Burgett, who is going to moderate our panel discussion. Thanks, everyone.
Well, thank you, Laura. That was great. And I'm wanting to let people know how we're going to do this question and answer session. It's, you know, we have 88 people on the call, so it's kind of difficult to moderate a session with open mics. So I'm going to have to be kind of the bad guy and try to herd the discussion here. So what we're going to do, my name is Jeff Burgett, by the way, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Science Applications. I'm going to sort of say how we're going to do the chat system here for this discussion. So the questions can be, will eventually be addressed to the panel who you see here, and I'll let them introduce themselves in a minute. And also to Laura, if you have specific questions about the presentation and the results. So, so she's going to stay on the line and be available to answer as well. What we're going to do with the chat is, again, to reiterate, please don't hold or start conversations in the everyone chat. It becomes hard to see stuff. I'm going to ask for your questions for a particular person after they introduce themselves, and then I will pitch those questions to the appropriate panelists. So we will save the chat. Now this chat is being recorded like the rest of the meeting. And if any questions or issues are unable, we can't address them because of lack of time, we'll be able to revisit them in later discussions after today. So we'll get back to you with the summary of all those things, and we'll keep them as topics for later use. So I'm going to move to the panel discussion here, and I'm going to thank the panelists, first of all, for agreeing to be part of this. They were kind of voluntold, no, they volunteered, I guess. But as I call them, they're going to activate their video camera, and they will give a short bio, introduce themselves, and then I've asked them to prepare 1 or 2 questions or issues that they think in their area of expertise really come to the fore in terms of thinking about this intersection of invasive species and climate change. So I'll go alphabetically. So I'll start with Curt Daehler. You can turn on your video and mic, please. And go ahead and
am I appearing?
Yeah, you're fine.
I'm good. Hello, welcome everyone. I'm Curt Daehler. I'm at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. My students and I study the ecology and spread and impacts of invasive species. We monitor patterns of spread across the islands, and we're also interested in trends among new arrivals that are each year starting to spread into new habitats across the islands. And then some of us also look at the strategies for preventing invasion. And my 2 questions, one is, would it be valuable for us to assemble and share lists of specific ways that manage research products today, and that those could be shared with the island. The question relates to.
Sorry, Curt, this is Jeff. You're really breaking up and we're having a hard time hearing your questions. Could you restate your questions?
In their management plans, and do they consider future fire risks associated with invasions and climate change? How would that change management plans in the future? So those are my 2 questions, and
Thanks, Curt. We had a little hard time hearing you, but I think people got the gist, and we'll be able to expand on some of those issues when we go forward. So Lucas, you can leave your camera on, Curt. Lucas, could you introduce yourself and give us your 2 cents? You're muted. Lucas, we're not hearing anything. Can you activate your? You're not having. Okay, we'll let you solve your problem, and I'll move over to Clay. Clay, could you activate your camera and give us your bio and your questions?
Yeah, I'm Clay Trauernicht. I'm an extension specialist at the University of Hawaii, so in CTAR. And part of the work that I do, my background is in plant ecology, but part of the work I do mostly now is assessing wildfire risks, so there's a bunch of modeling for that. But I also do a lot of hands-on extension work, so kind of communicating the science out into the world and trying to make sure science addresses management needs. And so I guess my 2 questions are sort of how we're doing on the extension side. You know, are we meeting the information needs out there? How can we do that better? And do we need to adjust, especially given the situation we're all facing right now? And then my second question or issue is just opportunities to scale up these kinds of efforts. So obviously I'm thinking about fire a lot, and that has to do with grassland and rangeland management. And that is taking on spatial scales that are quite large. To be able to tackle those kinds of issues, we need to be doing management at large spatial scales. Those are things I'm interested in.
Thank you, Clay. Can you, can you mute yourself and we'll get back to Lucas then?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. I just have to restart everything. Yeah, so anyway, I'm Lucas Fortini. I'm a research ecologist with USGS Pierce Pacific Island Ecosystems Research Center. Have been working here in Hawaii for the last 10 years or so. And during that time, I have developed partnerships with the Landscape Conservation Cooperative, PIXI, and the Climate Adaptation Science Center, and many other management agencies, kind of to try to develop quantitative landscape level approaches to tackle large conservation problems, such as climate change. So with those partners and others, I kind of have been developing some research that tries to explore the impacts of climate change on Pacific Island native plants, native forest birds, habitats, and of course, since it's something that we all are very concerned about, the impacts of climate change on invasive species and vice versa. It's very challenging to think about what are a couple of issues that I think of are of relevance to the very complex nexus between climate change and invasive plants or invasive species in general. Just going through brainstorming that up until last minute, I already have a list of 9. So I guess I'll randomly pick a couple. So let's see. One a huge concern I have from an ecological standpoint is just how is the potential for climate change to speed up invasion. I think that contrary to belief, intact native ecosystems here in Hawaii are quite resilient to invasion, but it's when you have increased disturbance or altered disturbance regimes is when you are able to actually have, a speed up of the conversion to non-native ecosystems. The other thing also to consider ecologically is how, on the flip side of that, is how invasive themselves are able to perhaps reduce the effectiveness of native species to respond effectively to climate shifts. So for instance, if we're talking about the potential for species to shift in distribution to a shifting climate, how that is really hard when you have a landscape increasingly dominated by invasive species. And I'm sorry, I can't resist, but I have to include a third one, which is very broad, is just how to tackle the compiled uncertainty of modeling both climate impacts on ecosystems and the uncertainties inherent in invasive species modeling as well.
Thank you, Lucas. That's great. And hopefully we'll get Curt back at some point. But at this point, I'll move over to Toni. Can you give us your bio and your burning questions?
Okay, hope everyone can hear me. Yeah, my name is Toni Montgomery. I'm a biologist, marine biologist at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Ecological Services here in Honolulu. I do a lot of different things in marine systems, anywhere from in my former life where I did a lot of work on marine invasive species, although I don't do much of that these days. But I'll do a lot of work on impact assessments for water development projects, do a lot of research on deeper water systems, and so forth. So when Jeff asked me to kind of talk about how marine invasive species and climate change intersect, I thought, that's interesting. I'm not certain he can attest. I'm not certain I'm the best person for this, but I could give it a go. So it's an interesting topic, and I don't think it's one that gets as much attention that maybe it should, or at least get a little bit more discussion. So when he asked me to do the 2 questions for that, I figured the best way to kind of couch a discussion question would be, I view the issues of marine invasive species kind of in the context of climate change under 2 kind of topics. And one would be the ecological changes within the reef communities or the tropical communities that the climate change, whether it's warming more likely, or ocean acidification, or additional storms and the changes or the disturbance of the storms provide for that. The ecological changes that would be associated with the climate projections. But I think one aspect that gets overlooked is the other aspect, and that's the changes in our human society. How does that affect our pathways, our vectors, migration patterns, our development to make more resilient communities and shorelines? And so I kind of pose the question is, how do we balance those two aspects, and do we want to prioritize one of those as we deal with particularly new introductions? And so the second question is in the context of that first question, and it's something that I've thought a lot about, and I hadn't ever had a chance to dive into it as much as I've always wanted. But how do you develop an effective surveillance system or early detection program in light of what changes we might see? So if you're focusing on ecological changes, how do you develop a system that can detect those changes in a timely manner? Or if you're looking at the human dynamics of our society and how we're changing things, how do you develop an early detection system to detect new introductions through that avenue? So I leave those as open questions, and I'm happy to share my thoughts if anyone has further questions.
Thanks, Tony. If you could mute yourself until we get a question at you, that'd be great. And last, but certainly not least, Adam, can you give us your benefit of your knowledge?
Sure. Just there we go. And I love that you found the grad school picture of me. It's hilarious. But yeah, thanks for having me, Jeff, and thanks team for kind of making this possible. As far as my background, I'm a quantitative ecologist for the Pacific Islands Fish and Wildlife Office. My main job is with strategic habitat conservation program. And in that program, we look to efficiently and effectively kind of not only manage our grown and endangered resources, but also inform managers. And so that kind of highlights really everything we do. I develop models and tools for the managers to kind of understand the distribution of a species or understand the efficacy of mitigation in relation to an HCP applicant, HCP habitat conservation plans. I mean, that's kind of the basics, but we also, and what I've also am involved in, I'm a co-lead with Joshua Fisher on development of new technology tools for use for the next generation of biotechnology tools and next generation of conservation tools for use in Hawaii. One of those being the Wolbachia-based tool that the service is developing for Hawaii, and there are multiple others as well. And kind of my issues are directly associated with some of my current interests, and it's because my interests are right now are what I'm working on. So my interests are kind of in adapting and developing the next generation of conservation tools to inform or solve some of the services kind of most intractable conservation issues. I think globalization and climate change are pretty much the main ones there, or at least the ones causing most of the problems. And then, of course, modeling efficacy of invasive species control to project mitigation on a T&E species. And kind of the issues, you asked two issues associated with that, and mainly regarding the first interest, that is development of new biotechnology products for conservation. What are the regulatory processes for incorporating or managing those new tools? I mean, we for instance, like gene drive or CRISPR-based tools or RNAi, any of these new technologies, even Wolbachia, which is an old technology adapted to a new system called conservation, it doesn't have that regulatory pathway necessary to actually apply this work on the ground. And so that's what me and my team, at least our team, Josh and I, and some others with strategic science applications and outside and inside Hawaii are working on. And another interest is the second interest, modeling efficacy in relation to invasive species control and incorporating climate change. And I pretty much inform managers on a daily basis, if not hourly basis. But every tool that I develop, it's to inform those managers, to inform the conservation of a strategic or a resource strategically. So with every climate change model, there's a lot of uncertainty in climate projections. And I believe kind of Lucas detailed some of this. And you can't eliminate that. You can't remove that. And so one of the things I'm working on is ways to kind of give managers that single number while incorporating all of those other numbers. And like all of everything else I've done in the past, you have to incorporate these multiple projections of the future, because there are multiple projections of the future currently with climate change projections. But that is kind of problematic because managers focus on that single number, and most likely they're going to focus on the midpoint scenario, which is, I think, is not necessarily the correct use, or is not necessarily correct in how, at least as I think of it as a quantitative ecologist. So I'm trying to guide that conversation away from just pointing and associating with that single number of the midpoint, and more associating with a kind of a probability. For instance, informing mitigation efficacy, or for an HCP applicant, suggesting that they control invasive species at a certain level such that it will incorporate 80% of probable likelihood of them mitigating for their take, something along those lines. It's kind of more of a Bayesian application. Okay, thanks.
Great, thanks, Adam. So now I'm going to open it up for the chat. So everybody sees the little bubble on the right-hand side. They can pull up the chat. The panelists can keep their cameras active, but keep their microphones muted. And I'll just try to, if you have any questions for any of the panelists, or if you have questions about the survey and its results, please type them into the chat under everyone, and I will, if I don't see any that are obvious to well, and basically I'll just wait to see some. Actually, while you're thinking of one, I'm going to toss one out there for Lucas. And that's a question. So we've heard that there's a problem with delivering issues that are, or projections that are relevant to small scales and short time frames. But we've also heard, as Adam mentioned, that there's a lot of uncertainty that's irreducible. So in your mind, what should people do in the absence of these projections? And so then basically, are they really needed? And if they're needed, what should they do until they get them?
Yeah, no, I think, yeah, it's really a challenge, of course, as has been discussed earlier. I think Laura mentions, like, a lot of the past work has done modeling at that longer term time horizon. And there's a clear reason for that, is that if you try to model climate, too close from current conditions, the noise and variability that, that's compounded by, the inherent uncertainty in the climate, at the global level, at the regional level, and the modeling uncertainties and all those things, then that so-called noise is a lot bigger than the very slight potential change that you may expect between, let's say, now and a 5-year time window. So I think if people are interested in looking at that short-term time step, one thing that I know I have been working on in some of my efforts is simply looking at existing trends in climate for the state, whether, whichever climate variable of interest, whether it's precipitation, drought, frequency, and all those things, and start thinking about, detecting those patterns that have been, that are emerging here in across the islands, and try to project those impacts, carefully forward, maybe, a few years to, 1 or 2 decades at most, and see what could the implication be of those continued trends. So that, it's a simplistic approach, but that's one thing to do. But yeah, I think it's perhaps is the most sensitive thing to do if people are really interested in that short-term question. But at the same time, I know, probably managers want that shorter-term time horizon in our analysis, because that's the let's say the cycle or of planning, decision making, and so forth. But I would just advise that I do recognize the huge uncertainties that there are in the long-term projections that we have focused on. But I still think that those are important to be held in mind, because yeah, if you're only thinking 5 years ahead, and we have, of course, these trajectories of like temperature or whichever other climatic shift expected for the island that will be, really large for the next, several decades, you kind of have to balance those two scales. So, yeah, so it's complicated. There's not a right answer, I think. I'm sure, Adam or Clay or others would be able to opine on that as well.
Curt, did you have any comment on that? Okay. I have a couple questions, and this is for any panelist that wants to answer them. And it's forecasting inherently requires models, and models need data. What are the main data limitations to forecasting the ecological intersection of climate change and invasive species? So, yeah, Clay, go.
I will just say that anything you're trying to model just depends on the quality of that response that you're after, right? And so trying to understand where an invasive species is going to be potentially spread into, one of the biggest limitations is because these species are new to the Hawaiian Islands, we don't quite understand what their potential, the niche that they'll fill, right? So that's one of the challenges. It's pretty simple, saying how do we know what the sort of environmental or climatic limitations are going to be for any given species that comes in.
Can somebody mute their phone, please? Thank you. Yeah, Lucas, go.
Well, I think, yeah, I agree with Clay in that sense. And I think one of the problems we had in past efforts in trying to model invasive distributions here in Hawaii, actually work that we did with Adam Vorsino and others, is the problem is that people tend to collect data on areas that they care about and not areas where these species are thriving or that, the battle essentially has been lost. So, when you try to develop models based on those data sets, you get a very skewed representation of where species are most closely associated or most, in our model. So it's kind of challenging to deal with that. There's, of course, many kind of modeling approaches to try to deal with that bias. One of the things we have started doing is starting to do models that look at the global distribution of the species in other areas where they have also invaded. But of course, as Clay mentioned, there's the issue of founder effect and the fact that, yes, it's quite likely, depending on, what's the genotypes and so forth that reach the island and so forth, and, how it interacts with the ecological community here, how it may, the species may actually occupy a pretty different niche from where from what's observed elsewhere.
Okay, I can see Curt is back online. And so, Curt, did you want to address this question? Models need data. What are the main data limitations to forecasting the ecological impacts of climate change on invasive species? Okay, well, we'll let him off the hook for that one. Have another question here. Can any of the panelists suggest why the seasonal forecasts did not seem very important in the survey? Any ideas? Go ahead.
Laura?
Yeah.
Laura?
Laura?
Hey guys, I just collected the data and presented it, so it's up to you.
Well, one idea is just thinking about from a management perspective is how do you what goes into your decision making and your planning over the course of a year, and so depending on how you are how would seasonal variability in the climatic conditions affect your program of work. So if there's not a lot to be taken away from that. You know, if they know that I'm planting in the wet season and I'm doing other stuff in the dry season, maybe it's just a function of that. We sort of know, at least based on the patterns, as regular as they can be, we sort of know that's already built into our work plans. So that might be one, just an idea. I'm throwing stuff out there.
Curt, did you have an idea? You can activate your camera, Curt, if you, or maybe not. I guess maybe a bandwidth issue. I have a question for Toni, actually. So on the continental areas, we've seen a lot of climate impacts, you know, marine heat waves that have really changed ecosystems. And here we have the similar effects of extreme events on coral reefs and probably other more less obvious species that are also being affected. What kind of, this is again back to the data question, what kind of data need to be collected in your mind in order to get to a place where we can address what impacts those things have on invasive species here?
Well, that's a good question, and it kind of would go back to it's related to your first question. You're asking about what kind of data in the marine realm. It's we're in a far different place when we're dealing with new introductions a lot of times, and many times our first step is we don't even know what it is. And if you look at the recent algae that was found up at I believe French Frigate Shoals, I don't think there's still a conclusive ID on that, and we certainly don't even know where it came from or how it would get there, if it even was truly native. So when you go back and you look at the work that's been done literally over the last 20 years, the big question that has to be addressed is it introduced or cryptogenic, and a big chunk of the species we don't know are just a classification of cryptogenic. You know, doesn't mean they still can't have impacts. They certainly can, but the taxonomy is often the first obstacle we have. And then from there, you can start to look at what kind of ecological niche that thing would fulfill. And in the marine realm, there's a lot of competition for open space. So it you know, I would say it's maybe different than the plant ecology section, and my colleagues can correct me if I'm wrong on that. But there's a lot of resistance for things to get established and taking over. So just understanding what species there are and coming in is a first step of even understanding of what kind of problems they're going to cause.
Okay, great, thanks. I have another question. Says, I know we have a lot of managers on the line. Can you talk about the process you use for engaging managers and sharing information or knowing that your research is being applied? So this gets back to a big issue in the survey of how they gain the information that they need, they say they need. So can everybody actually speak to that? Clay, can you just start over there?
Sure. Yeah, so I'm the lead on Pacific Fire Exchange. So this is like an effort just to do that very thing, to kind of get better information, more relevant information in the hands of folks making decisions on the ground. And so we kind of rely on these traditional methods. We do, you know, informational products like fact sheets and sort of technical guides and workshops. As we saw in the results, people really value the in-person things. So we do field trips and workshops a lot too. And I think that, you know, we've had some opportunities to evaluate. You know, our field trips and workshops always get like good feedback. The informational products, it's harder to suss out how often people are using them or how useful they are. And I guess I'm really interested. One of my issues is trying to figure out now what if we're sort of restricted in our ability to have these face-to-face interactions. You know, or do people have preferences about how do we maybe adjust things moving forward? I know a lot of the folks are still considered essential. You know, watershed partnerships, forestry, all those guys are still doing the work. So, you know, how do we move beyond or adjust to these preferences people have for face-to-face interactions when there might not be possible right now?
Thanks, Clay. From the academic side, Curt, can you discuss that? Earth to Curt. Okay, well, jump in when you can. Adam, can you address that in terms of engaging people, sharing information, and figuring out whether it's applied?
Sure. I mean, I think the key words is engage early and often. And a lot of times the tool you develop isn't the tool they want. Even as much as you put into it, the tool you develop is probably never going to be the tool you want or they want. So listen closely, engage early and often, and make sure that they understand your product, that the products are complicated, whatever we do. And earlier there was a question, how do we make models without the data? Well, we just make models using assumptions. Models are there not only to inform us regarding like the projected trend of something, they're there to understand what we need and what we don't have. So that is directly informing management as well.
Great. Lucas?
Sure, yeah. So, yeah, I think that's a really important issue that I always consider in my research. I almost view like part of my role as a researcher is part extension. It's really interesting to see from the survey that people really value that one-to-one communication as a way to integrate the kind of information in their decision making, and that's kind of how, over the years, especially working with Pixie, I felt like that was always the most effective way of getting people to really incorporate scientific information in their decision making. The reality is that managers just seem just so overwhelmed by so many different pools on a daily basis that you really have to understand kind of what are the decisions they have at hand, what are the kind of like ways that the information we can provide can best help that decision. And I think we are, in a way, the best people to be able to judge that and kind of like not digest, but like a lot of times what I have found with working with partners is kind of developing, kind of like custom products, like spin-off products or analyses that really, take the information generated from study and like really make it in a way that really directly answers a question that the manager is trying to answer or have answered for decision making. And in general, this should not be an opportunistic thing where I think in general just having an open channel communication between us as researchers and managers, because you find that whole process is a lot more smooth if you have been kind of including managers from the start and getting their input in shaping the research along the way. And yeah, it ends up being a lot easier for you to kind of like integrate their concerns along the way.
Toni, did you want to go any further on that issue about getting feedback with and from managers, or do you want to move on to anything else?
Yeah, that's not my, since I'm not actively doing invasive species management, I don't think I can speak well to that now. So.
Okay, we have a question. The issue of data comes up, and people are wondering, are there certain data or types of data that would help the modelers that we should be collecting and we're not? I know that long time series, of course, are really important, but is there something else that the people that are in charge of monitoring should be generating in a way or making available in a way that would help modelers answer these key questions? That's open to anybody that wants to chime in.
Sure, I'll try and put in something there, Jeff. It depends on the model that we're producing, right? I mean, demographic information for rat control and the efficacy of control in relation to, I don't know, some approach that is used on the ground, that is always helpful. Distributions of species in areas that aren't often collected. I think Lucas mentioned that in a publication on when he was talking about a publication we worked on. I mean, all of that information is valuable. I think that direct association of temperature we can make, but that distributional assessment in relation to climate in a specific area at a specific time at a high resolution, I think that would be quite valuable to anything I do when I inform management and the efficacy of that management.
Okay, I have some other questions. We need to kind of move forward here. So one was following up on the Pixie mention, what is the role of boundary organizations in Hawaii for sharing climate information with managers? And I think that would include the Pacific RISCC, maybe, certainly the Climate Adaptation Science Center and others. Should that role, well, what is your opinion on the role and the lack of, in the sense of that being maybe an issue with reaching more people with this information? Or did I just ask an unanswerable question?
Well, I mean, I can say this is something, yeah. Well, so as I mentioned, I worked with Pixie, which kind of embedded with Pixie, including with Jeff and others for several years before it was disbanded, and it was actually one of those so-called boundary organizations. And I can say my job's a lot harder now because having sure I try to dabble on so-called extension, but it takes a lot of time, and building those connections and facilitating those communications and so forth with partners and reaching out and so forth, that is a huge amount of work. And I don't think managers have the time to do it. Researchers, I make a conscious effort when I'm trying to focus more on that kind of stuff than on research, which is actually how I'm graded on my job. So I think that at the end, the boundary organizations really fit that critical need, because researchers, we don't get graded mostly for doing that reaching out, and managers just have actual things that they're desperately trying to save, out there. So yeah, it's critical.
Jeff, this is Laura. I just want to jump in from the Pacific RISCC side. We've I think done made a lot of effort over the last year or two, especially through the Pacific Islands Regional Climate Assessment reports that are available online, and the living bibliography that one of the staff at East West Center, Zena Greckney, has put together under perca.org to consolidate a lot of what we know and a lot of the tools that are available for the impacts of climate change on various sectors. But we do have, similar to some of the results from the survey, there's a knowledge gap, and there aren't as many tools that are relevant to natural resource management as yet available in Hawaii. So I think for those of us who work in the boundary organization space, we need to be having these conversations in the room with the managers and climate information producers to figure out exactly what are the next steps for developing usable information and moving that forward.
Great, thank you. And I also see a thing from Darren Lerner about saying that the Pacific Islands Climate Adaptation Science Center and the science centers in general are ramping up climate extension services. And in Hawaii, HICASC is doing so in partnership with Sea Grant. So thank you, Darren, for that comment. Another question, how can we best support or advocate for the types of data collection that are necessary for building models or making projections? Anyone? Lucas, you always have some. Okay.
Sorry, yeah, but I think the first thing is before we know what data to focus on, we have to focus on prioritize what are kind of questions that we really need answered. Based on that, we have to define what are the methods that are best, most feasible for us to answer those questions, and then we can prioritize kind of data collections. And maybe that's kind of like the role that like a emerging group from this panel could start tackling, which is, I know my colleague at Pierce, Helen Sofer, she's just the recent invasive species biologist for the center, and she's been just having a lot of discussions with people all over the state. Okay, what are the kind of questions that we really need to be answered in terms of like invasive species, biology, biocontrol, and all these related fields. And it seems like there's a lot of ways. There's an infinite set of questions, and we have to like limit to the ones that we really need to know now.
Any other comments on that? Okay, one of the results that was shared showed that there is great interest in more user-friendly tools. What do you need in order to make sure that your workup ends up in some usable form like a tool? And this is, again, I think, part of this discussion about how to find the needs, but that's kind of more of a specific question.
I think it's all interrelated, right? It's back to kind of what Lucas was saying is what are the relevant questions. And so, and then this question in particular is actually one for the audience, right? So we're like not in the greatest position as a panel to answer that, apart from what we've learned from experience, right? So for example, people love maps. And I saw in the survey, there's this desire to have maps that are more scaled. And so, one example is, well, do we understand, like I make the assumption that most programs have capacity to use GIS, right? So if I produce a statewide map, then the assumption is there, well, depending on what scale that's produced at, someone would have the sort of in-house capacity to look at it in more detail, but maybe that's not the right assumption we should be going for, And so it also ties back to what we were just talking about, this role of boundary organizations, and where you start, I think those of us that do this kind of work, when we do get chances to work together or talk shop, we're always worried about sort of being duplicative, like having how many portals for like different information types, and sort of scattering all this information out into the winds. So consolidating things, but also then turning the conversation of the spotlight back to the folks using the information. I mean, and understanding who we should be asking those questions. But yeah, it's a challenge interpreting the data, but then also making it usable. So once your analysis is done, like Lucas said, for him at USGS, they're measuring his performance by getting that publication into a journal. But for him, like to make this stuff actually applicable, you want to get it in the people's hands in a way that makes sense for them. So yeah, like how are people integrating this information into their own sort of workflows and decision-making processes is a pretty key part to tackle.
Well, I think you actually mentioned something there that is probably also important from people in academia like Curt, in that one thing you need to make sure that you're getting stuff out there is that you actually are supported by your institution or its metrics of success to actually do that work. And if you're not, then makes it all the more difficult because you're taking away from the effort that you should be putting on something else. Clay, are you back online at all? Oh, sorry, not Clay. Curt. Technical difficulties, I guess. Okay, so we have another question. Back to time frames. Some existing priority species in Hawaii may become less problematic with changing climate. Others may become more problematic. And over associated temporal scale, maybe over decades. What advice can the panelists give managers about how and when to shift the emphasis of their actions during that associated gradient? I assume means from one species to another, basically reprioritizing as we go forward. Adam, I'm going to put you on the spot.
I can't think of one that's going to become less problematic given temperature, but I'd be interested in that example. I mean, I think that the 5-year gradient works pretty well right now. But I guess that implies that we're monitoring over 5 years. That's one of the problems, is we don't necessarily monitor over a 5-year term within that time frame. So it's kind of important to understand how these species are affecting and different organisms of the resources we protect, and we can only do that with actual data on the ground. And even given the modeling assumptions, we can't necessarily include those. So I guess it gets back to modeling need or monitoring needs and inclusion of those monitoring results into the modeling assessment. And right now, it's on a 5-year term for the Fish and Wildlife Service, but as the trend in climate change starts to kind of get faster, I think that maybe that needs to be decreased potentially in the near term.
Anyone else? Timeframes and reprioritizing? Yeah.
I would just like to add that a lot of this is going to really come from, you know, I would say this is like when it comes to site specific questions like that, like the folks working there are the experts really in this context. And so it's invasive species are really difficult because you sort of, you know, the focusing on sort of incipient transitioning to these established things. But I think that a lot of this, so much of this depends on the system in question, having a clear baseline for what you want to achieve in that ecosystem or management unit, and then really thinking about, you know, outside of climate, like I don't want to derail the climate change impact part, but really learning as much as we can about the successional ecology of these species, right? And so like in post-fire environments, you're going to get tons of weeds that come in, and it's gonna, as like I always like to quote Rhonda Lowe at Volcano National Park. She's like, it's gonna look really ugly, right, off the bat for the first few years. But you know, a good number of those species you don't really have to worry about because the ecological succession will kind of take care of it, and you start to realize how to focus your efforts on the ones that are really causing you problems. And so, given like the lifespan of certain species, so they, for example, focusing on these long-lived woody invaders has been an approach by a bunch of watershed partnerships that I've been helping out with. You know, they all have their sort of target species. And to be honest, in a 5-year time window, it's really going to be the ecology and biology of those species that are going to matter more than a climate, than a shift in climate, to be frank. That's my opinion, though.
Okay, thanks. Curt, did you make it back on? Okay. Anybody else have something to say about the temporal scales? I have another question. Okay. Can each of the panelists share an example of how climate change modeling is being applied to on the ground or in the water operations and decision making in Hawaii? So Toni, just because I just said water, I'll focus on you. So is anybody actually using this information in ways that impact decision making?
I don't want to take it out here, but I'm just not aware of any. There's certainly modeling stuff out there, but not in the context of climate change and marine invasive species. And it, you know, certainly if there's going to be anyone probably doing it, it's going to be the marine phycology folks. So, but I'm just not aware of it currently.
Okay. Clay, you guys, yeah.
Yeah, well, just some sort of case studies, working with folks on the Big Island where we've used fire, among other things, as sort of a response variable to understand the outcomes of changes in land cover, right? So in other words, restoration, like what do you get from restoration? And so I guess maybe this is more trying to map out like potential futures versus you know, the kind of decisions where like, do I plant today or not, or those kinds of things day to day. It's more about looking at like, okay, what do we get under these future conditions if we were to go down this road versus another road. And so in that example for Pu'uawa, and we did for Kaupulehu as well as an example, you know, what changes occur if you were actually able to do like full scale watershed restoration? Like what do you get from that? And I think that's where it becomes really useful. The managers then get to sort of either make decisions about where they should prioritize these actions, but they also get to try to make the case to funders to say like what would be possible, how much it would cost, et cetera.
Okay, Adam, you're in the mosquito world. How are these projections actually affecting decision making?
I mean, I would say that they've definitely prioritized some of the decisions or some of the species because of it. I think the modeling that Lucas and I did initially they showed the possible extinction within the near future of some of the forest bird species, mainly due to incursion by mosquitoes and avian malaria into these upper elevation refugia, forest bird refugia. So because of that, the service has prioritized kind of mosquito control and specifically development of a landscape scale mosquito control tool. So we've kind of been focusing on these new biotechnology applications, and kind of because we've been focusing on those biotechnology applications because of climate change, we've also been looking at them in the context of other species and integrated pest management, using them in an IPM scenario for those other species as well. So I think these models have quite a bit of power once developed, as long as they're also integrated some management or some managers within those decision points within the overall assessment, and kind of providing that information to those managers. So Lucas kind of brought up a great point where, once we develop these tools, it's not really something I said before, that it's not really the tool that the managers are looking for, but we listen to the managers and we develop a subsequent tool based off of that tool that the managers are looking for. And so I think because of that, we've really been able to prioritize specific types of management and the development of products for these specific conservation issues related to climate change. So that all that is to say, it can be quite powerful.
Anyone else? Yeah,
Sure.
Lucas?
Yeah, I mean, well, this does not pertain much to the invasive and climate nexus, but a lot of our past work that we have done regarding impacts of climate change, a lot of the work we have done to try to explore the impacts of climate change on native plant species has been used. I know Fish and Wildlife Service for recovery plans, for candidate assessments. I know similar work we have done for forest bird impacts of climate change. That kind of information was used for listing a decision for EEV. The state has been using a lot of our analysis of impacts of climate change on rare plants on prioritizing monitoring and seed banking efforts. We did some subsequent analysis that has also was incorporated in some prioritization for where to fence next in terms of fencing priorities for some of the islands. And more recently, we were actually a working partner with Maui DOFA, Maui Nui, to try to determine how to integrate climate change ecological forecasts that we have developed to best decide where they should be focusing plant conservation effort across the landscape that will yield the best long-term consequence for this huge set of species that they're currently trying to manage.
Great. Okay, we have time for one more question here. And it's kind of a general question. There's two related questions here. Is there a central location right now to find tools and resources on climate change related scenarios, including ArcGIS maps with model outputs? And also related to that, I know folks are working on models and maps related to fire risk. What about risk and vulnerability of other climate change related disturbances? So basically, where can I find all this information that you keep referring to? And where is the central repository for risk analysis and vulnerability? That's kind of an easy question because there is not one, actually. So one of the issues now is that there are many efforts that are working on this, but there's no central organization that is collating all of the studies and making them all available in a user-friendly format. And so it remains one of those things where there's products that attempt to bring the information together and make them available. We did some of that at Pixie. Some of that is being done with the Climate Adaptation Science Centers and Pacific RISA. Laura mentioned the PERCA and sorry, brain fart there. Other efforts, but you still have to go to multiple places to find what you want. And I think that's unfortunate, but the The problem is that nobody is paid to do that. And we are, when Pixie was defunded, that was one of the things we were aspiring to do, but still it was a big job even for us to do that. So anyway, so sorry to say, we don't have a quick answer for you. And anybody else want to kind of add on that?
I'll just say real quick that you know, disturbance is a huge part of this thing, right? Because a lot of these species aren't going to sort of realize their niche or have the opportunity to invade. You know, it's going to accelerate those things. But the bad news is like fire's easy. You know, lots of records. It's really easy to track and sort of map the impacts of fire, and that's sort of what forms the basis of the work that I do on like the research corner. But these other things might be a little bit more difficult to, you know, unless the sort of disturbance event is being documented and you get a long history of those kinds of events happening. This is just to address that specific part of that question, disturbance history and dynamics. It becomes a little bit more difficult to model those things going forward. So I always joke, I have it easy with fire because it's really easy to track and there's lots and lots of data to work with.
Jeff, this is Laura. I just wanted to say, you know, since we're almost to time for the panel discussion, that this question really does lead us nicely into Toni Lynn's presentation, where she'll be talking about how the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center tackled some of these issues of creating a centralized location for the tools and resources that already exist, and also prioritizing new research areas moving forward.
You stole my line there. Yeah, thank you. So thanks everyone. Thanks our panelists. I appreciate that. If you could just turn off your videos and mics. We're going to move on to the next section, which is Toni Lynn Morelli from the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center, who's going to talk to us about how they basically have created a clearinghouse and focus area, community of practice for this particular intersection. And so, and actually Heather is going to be doing the introduction, so I'll send it over to Heather. Sorry about that.
Thanks everyone for that great panel. And I do want to echo what Laura said and also appreciate that question, because I do think this is one of the motivations for having this conversation, and clearly the idea of a portal or web place for that information beyond invasives is an important one. So I did just want to introduce our guest speaker, Toni Lynn Morelli. She's a research ecologist for USGS and is part of the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center team. She uses geospatial analysis, species distribution modeling, and population and landscape genetic techniques to work on natural resource management and habitat and species conservation in climate and land use change. And for the purposes of this call, she is the leader, or one of the leaders in the development and operations of the Northeast RISCC. And while she says she isn't an invasives expert, her publications say otherwise. So we really appreciate her being here as we've kind of looked at this as a potential model for something we could do here. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Heather. Thanks, Jeff, Laura, all my fellow presenters. I'm really, and the 80 some of you that are here, I'm happy to be with you today. So yeah, I'm Toni Lynn Morelli. I'm with the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. So I sit up in the Northeastern US and Western Massachusetts. Now I sit at home, like many of you. And I am excited to talk about the work we've done with in exactly as you just heard, sort of this context of like, man, there's a lot to know, and where's the information, and how do we gather it together, and how do we make it applicable and relevant? And out of that kind of morass, we grew this regional network. So I want to tell you about that. I want to make sure to acknowledge my co-founders, the Bethany Bradley, who's faculty at UMass, and Carrie Brown Lima at the New York Invasive Species Research Institute at Cornell. And then there's a whole group of us too that get credit for all of this as well. Just a little context, although if you didn't know this an hour ago, you know this now, but there's actually a paper that I like to think about in the context of really almost pretty much quantifying this mismatch between the research that's happening and then what is actually needed to improve management and conservation. And so Virginia Matzek 5 years ago looked at invasive ecology, and essentially these two, I'll show you two figures, they'll be the same, and it's looking at what research is done and on particular topics versus what is the manager's wish was done. And so if you were on that zero line, it would be like exactly the amount of research for what managers wished would be out there. And you can see that for most categories, it skews to the left. So most categories, there's more research on a topic than is desired or usable. You can see that there's a whole big category of other there, but this is basic research. So maybe that's understandable. We've heard a lot about thinking about this in the context of kind of applied research. And so they looked at that as well and found that still there's so much less research on the topics that are wanted. So to the left, these are all the topics that managers wish they had more of. It's sort of to the left of that zero line. And then there's almost, you could say, too much on biocontrol, resource manipulation, and then this whole other category that wasn't even specified as interest to managers. So it's kind of the context of where we come from. And in that context, in general, in the work that I do, which is not just on invasive species, as Heather alluded to, but is mostly on climate change impacts, we have tried to build out this paradigm of translational invasion ecology. And that is essentially a spin-off of something we did a couple years ago, which you might have heard about, called translational ecology. So there's a special issue in ecology and the environment where we laid out this idea of this intentional process by which scientists and stakeholders and decision makers work together from the beginning to develop research that will result in improved decision making. And you can imagine, again, this is all should be very familiar, not just maybe in your day-to-day work, but also just from the last hour of thinking about this, bringing together these venues of practice and research. So we have the colleges and universities, science agencies, USGS, working on basic science and theory and even applied science and producing papers, working on modeling models. And then on the other side, there's the on-the-ground work, practitioners, land management agencies, trying to do adaptive management and mostly turning to mapping tools, reports, as was shown in the survey, maybe some web-based portals. And the idea is really to come together, bring those things together and on the basis of collaboration and trust in order to produce actionable science and ultimately better decision-making. So in our translational ecology special issue, that got built out into this flower petals of principles. And I think a lot of these things you've already heard sort of touched on in the last hour. They're fundamental principles that you have to keep in mind, but are also sort of a little squishy. We don't normally talk about in these contexts of science, but thinking about engagement in commitment. So when you're developing those relationships, that they are carried through over years and years. Good communication, what does that look like depending on the context and the partners? I'll talk a little bit about the process because it's really like fundamental thinking about process, even though it's kind of boring. Decision-making, framing context. So what are the decisions or actions that can actually be made? And so then what would be the science that could change that decision or improve that action? And if there's no decision framing context, which often there isn't, frankly, in a lot of science, then it certainly makes it so that you're not going to be impacting and improving the action as easily. And collaboration, which I think we're all here about. So this is a special issue. You can check it out. It might be of interest. We then took this idea. I just submitted this paper a couple of days ago. And we really wanted to highlight how we're doing this work with invasion ecology. And so this is the title of the paper, Bridging Research and Practice to Address One of the Greatest Threats to Biodiversity, so TIE. And here we actually laid out a kind of a flow diagram of how you might think about this. And in the top, you'll see that we make identifying the problem and identifying stakeholders sort of interchangeable in some ways. It's not always clear what is the first step. Sometimes it's bringing people together and saying, what is it you need? What is it that you are looking for? What decisions are you making that could be improved with better research or models or data? Sometimes you're aware of the problem and then you're bringing people together around it. And there's a lot of just meeting and discussing and iteration through this process and thinking about strategies and synthesizing and conducting research ultimately to improve outcomes. And we talk about products, outcomes and outputs. There's really good work. This is very closely related to knowledge co-production, that field in social science. There's really good work from Alison Meadow and her colleagues looking at thinking about the metrics of success for this, something that already came up earlier. We also, there was some talk about boundary spanning, so we felt like boundary spanners were an important piece of this, but not necessary. Some of us consider ourselves boundary spanners and some of us consider ourselves not boundary spanners. And so we really wanted to make clear that, as I think Lucas was saying, that you know, some of this work can be done if you're an officially boundary spanner is your title, or you actually just, you know, play one on Tuesdays or something. So I wanted to get into what we did as the RISC network. And the idea was we brought people around together around this idea of wanting to know more about how climate change was going to interact with invasive species. One of the important lessons I think we learned through this is that there was a lot of research into invasive species, a lot of intention on it, a lot of funding and personnel time going into invasive species on the ground. I understand never enough, but compared to some other areas, for example, that I work in, managers were really thinking a lot about this and actually acting on the ground on this topic. What we wanted to really bring to that conversation and that momentum was thinking, incorporating climate change into that. And it's really easy to maybe get distracted or get focused just on thinking about the invasive species. So we had to kind of keep coming back. We have to often come back to say we're here also to bring that climate change perspective, because there's wonderful invasive species networks out there already and lots of work and decades of people working on things. But in our experience, there's very little that's bringing those two topics together. So here's, as I said, process can be boring, so you might tune out in the next couple of minutes, but I wanted to kind of give you the nitty gritty of how we did things, because we're 5 years in now, 4.5 years in, and I think maybe we have some lessons that we've learned, some like, you know, failures and successes to share, and it's been really exciting that Heather reached out, and then we've also had interest from other places in the US thinking about growing this network across the country, or not just in our kind of sub-region of the Northeast and Midwest where we've been working. So we started because the three of us, Bethany Bradley, Carrie Brown Lima, and I came together. Bethany and Carrie actually work in invasive species, and we realized that there was a need there that wasn't being filled. And it started just as a brainstorm of a few people, kind of an academic, a boundary spanner, and then a research scientist coming together and saying, like, there is a need here, and could we help fill it? So we first just had a little workshop, 20 maybe stakeholders from state and federal agencies and NGOs sitting around a table and saying, what is it that you don't know, and what do you wish you knew, and what do you wish you had? And through that, we identified the preliminary priorities for our network. And all through the time that we've been working together, those priorities have been updated, but we constantly go back to our stakeholders and our partners and say, what is it that you would like to see and know? And we really make sure in that, and one of those flower petals of communication, that we're engaging and doing good communication to update, that the research scientists aren't just assuming what would be useful. So that's, we got, kind of got the ground under us in that first year, and then we held an official RISC symposium, which is like was a 2-day conference, our annual conference, which we then did 3 other times. And we started a website and a listserv. That listserv is now 350, 400 people. We got some external funding. We've done this kind of on a shoestring, wing and a prayer, though. I would guess the most funding we've had for the network itself, totally over the 5 years, we've had maybe $10,000 or something, depending on how you count it. Not a lot of money. And that's because the workshops and symposia have turned out to be, we find a place where we can hold a meeting that they don't charge us, and we offer some travel reimbursement, and most people can't use it or don't use it or other things. We then started having topical workshops that after, so just to remind myself that I just put it in once, but we've done that kind of throughout. And so we have found out where there's particular topics of interest, like related to phenology, and we've partnered with the National Phenology Network to hold a workshop, and other workshops that we do in sort of in between time of those symposia. In year 3, which was 2018, we really took off. So we had our 2nd annual RISC symposium. We had 120 participants. We started meeting regularly, so that's something we do now. So I meet with this group. We meet 90 minutes an hour and a half every week, all throughout the year, and there are about 15 of us. There's some graduate students, postdocs, faculty, and then we have some managers that I engage occasionally, and then we have other, we have a web developer working with us right now. We've also recruited graduate students onto it, and that's really helped carry some of the load of the work. Similar to the survey that you saw, we held a formal stakeholder survey, and I'll show you that in a minute. We've gotten a little bit more external funding, and then we started having biweekly research summaries and management challenges. So just to talk about that survey, this was led by a 2nd-year PhD student, and most of the people on the paper are postdocs or graduate students. So we were able to use the survey that we did of the stakeholders to actually publish it in a journal that then allowed, kind of gave credit for the academics to be doing this work. And you can still just pull that one figure from this paper just to show it's pretty similar to what was found in your survey. But the question was actually a little different, so we thought it would be interesting to show you. Essentially, if you just look at the gray bars, you see that the limitation to managing invasive species is funding and personnel. No big surprise. We found it interesting that it was less of an issue for incorporating climate change. So funding and personnel was still important, but information became more important, and that really felt like, a reason for being for RISC. Here's an example of what we do at our symposia. So this was a couple years ago. We had 11 speakers. Some are managers, some are researchers, speaking about tools, speaking about data, giving giving syntheses, taking on different topics. And then we have lots of conversations. We have little workshops within the symposia. So we had a conversation about what invasive impacts are most relevant to you, and we do some immediate polling so we can kind of see where everyone's at. So we try to get creative with it and make sure there's lots of input and lots of discussion happening, and not just conversations and presentation. I mean, not just presentations. I mentioned the research summaries. Some of you might have these. You're welcome to join our listserv because these papers are national and internationally relevant, not just for the Northeastern US. This started because we felt, frankly, our listserv we weren't saying much on it. And I think people were shy to post anything. And so I started just sending around journal articles that I thought would be interesting. And so I did that once every couple of weeks or something. And then it felt like maybe that we could do better than that. And so we took that and kind of upped the ante, and now we spend hours digesting particular articles we think would be of interest. And we write a manager-specific summary of an article. So it's not the abstract. It's really like what a manager or practitioner might want to know about this paper. And the paper itself is chosen because we think it's very relevant. So we put these out about once every 2 weeks, and now they're all on our website and they're searchable. So these summaries. So really trying to help bring the literature to the practitioners in a way that people often don't have time to digest. Our management challenges are taking that up a notch. So we spend dozens and dozens of hours, the group of 10 to 15 of us, on one particular topic that has been identified by our stakeholders at our network as being really important. And so you can see one was about kind of aquatic invasives. We did one on sleeper species. We did one just generally saying like, why do plant native species? And then we spent a lot of time distilling 20 to 50 journal articles into a one-pager. So just like two-sided piece of paper, good cardstock back when you got to hand things to people, and making it really pretty and really to the point. And there's always these kind of management suggestions at the end, thinking about how to act on this and how to improve the actions on the ground. So we have about 6 of these now. We just came out with one last week. Year 4, which was last year, we held our 3rd symposium. This time we did it along with the North American Invasive Species Management Agency's annual conference, which was nearby in New York. So we had a double session of talks with managers and scientists and researchers speaking, and then we had 2 long workshops. So we had basically 2 days of activities, and again, we had like 120 participants, totally full room. We also started increasing our outreach, so our students and postdocs are giving presentations around the state and around the region more and more, talking about the work that is out there and understanding the impacts of the interaction between climate change and invasive species. We have had a research project funded, which involves meeting with invasive plant councils in the region. So state by state going and sitting down at the table to hear what they needed. And that's led to a weed risk assessment project. We have developed a webinar series, which I think is kind of exciting. We've covered a couple different topics. We've been asked to we really wanted to hear about X species. And so then we've covered that, including trying, if a species is coming up, for example, from the south, we tried to pair managers who have already dealt with that species with researchers or managers or researchers on the topic, and then sharing it with an audience that maybe didn't know it was coming or knows it's coming but doesn't know how to deal with it. So really trying to get into the practicality of kind of when do you do something about it and what do you do? And then something I mentioned earlier I just wanted to stress was that we really are trying to have peer-reviewed publications happen. So that's really to the point of the different needs of managers versus scientists. So we just have a brand new website and we've been reevaluating our priorities. So I just put this paper out a couple days ago. If it's of interest, this is thinking about range shifting species using some invasion techniques. And then finally, I just wanted to say that lessons learned for us, including talking to stakeholders from the beginning, really to drive what you're doing, keeping the focus on climate change and invasive species. You're gonna have to put some time in, like it definitely takes time, but with the meetings, we really use meetings to do work together and not just talk about what we're gonna do. Respecting people's incentives, their strengths and limitations, which came up a bit already. Be flexible and be inclusive in who you involve. So here's our brand new website as of today, just came out. And I'm looking forward to the end of the discussion.
Well, thanks, Toni Lynn. Can you just stay on visual there? Does anybody have any questions for Toni Lynn about how they did it and what they're doing and what she thinks about what we're doing or anything else? Please put that into your chat. Thank you. Hopefully people are frantically typing. One question I had, Toni Lynn, is that it sounds like you have a good group that has essentially the time available and the interest to generate these products. And do you think that is partly because you have so many states that are there, or what's your magic ingredient that makes all that happen?
I think on the manager side, I would suspect you have even more people that are really, I mean, I think from the 77 people who have stuck with us for 2 hours is a sign of that. On the scientist side, I think it takes a couple people who are willing to be the glue and really prioritize the work. But, and as you've heard from the panelists, it can be tricky to navigate what you get rewarded for in academia or in USGS or whatever, with doing the work that's very like local scale, really relevant to the kind of boots on the ground things that managers are looking for. But that said, you know, I wanted to highlight that we've gotten papers out because I want to make the point that you can do this work, this translational work, and still get publications in high impact journals and check those boxes.
Right. So we have a question. What are the common metrics managers are using to track outcomes with respect to weed management? I guess this is kind of like wanting to understand how it works up there in the Northeast. So the common metrics that are tracking outcomes with respect to weed management.
I don't think I can answer that, Clay. I'm really sorry. This is where I admit my my ignorance.
Okay. I'm not seeing any other questions for Toni Lynn. Oh yeah, here we are. Right. Now they're rolling in. Are there other regional networks like yours, or is yours the first? How did you decide on the scale for the network?
Right. Good question, Curt. So, and that's good. Welcome, Curt. So, no, I don't think there are. I think we're the only ones. Certainly with invasive species, to be clear. I mean, with climate change, to be clear. And our footprint is mostly the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center, although until like yesterday or tomorrow, it's not really clear. The Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center included the Midwest, and we really didn't get into the Midwest as much because Bethany Bradley, one of our main PIs, does a lot of modeling of invasive species, and she really does like New York and New England, like proper Northeast. So that's mostly where we had our strictest boundary, but we always tried to kind of pull in the Midwest as well. But as I said, I'm really happy to say that North Central is interested, the Northwestern US CASC is interested, and here we are talking to you. So I think we might be on the cusp of kind of going national. And I don't mean we as in our RISC, because one of the things about this project and this process is it really has to be locally based. Right. So like, this is in no way a pitch for me to be like, let me lead it, you know, you need to like be right there. And so what we're hoping is just to let people know that like, you can do it. It's so rewarding. It's so rewarding. I don't know anything about invasive species, and I like keep doing this stuff because it's really so rewarding because there's so much work to be done. Yeah, so we're just like happy to watch spin-offs of this happen in a way that like can only happen with people that are in the place where they want the work to be done.
Heather's asking about next steps, but I'm going to hold that one until our discussion following here. Question, is your network involved in advancing climate change invasive species goals through the legislative process, either on the local or state level?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we really, so I'm with USGS, so I'll say they. My academic partners, really flirt with the policy side of things. There's a lot of conversation around the table that like none of this is going to change until there's different, you know, thoughts on the policy. For the most part, it hasn't been something we have dealt with, but we recognize that there is, that's a really important focus.
So just to follow up on that, so you have a variety of different states. Do you see different emphasis within those or between those states in terms of how seriously they take this?
Absolutely. And it's been neat to have the New York partner, my co-founder, Carrie, because she's really tapped into New York, and they do different things than Massachusetts, where I sit, and other states. Yeah, so we have 22 states within the Northeast CASC footprint. So there's lots of different examples of how things are done well, or maybe not so well, and all the different invasive species management councils and such on the ground. And we're more and more trying to bring states together and say like, so that they then go, oh, we do it this way. And somebody else goes, oh, maybe we should too. And really trying to share the information among them. So they're very much like their own fiefdoms, but they're starting to hear from each other and listen a little bit more. And that's been a really exciting part of the process.
That's great. Paul, we're just wanted to highlight that Fish and Wildlife Service, the Northwest CASC, and EcoAdapt are just now launching a similar network that will focus mainly on Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. So that's a new start this year, so we'll see how that goes. There's a question here. Do you think managers mostly change their tactics and priorities in response to the climate change information, or are they also changing their goals for a system? What are our thoughts on how confident one has to be in the future scenarios to justify changing priorities and goals?
Yeah, that's a good one. I would say for the most part, we've been working both in this work I do, but kind of all the climate adaptation work I do. I've mostly been working in the realm of refocusing priorities in terms of locations or species. So mostly do what you were doing before, but just do it slightly differently. So recognize that like, add these 10 species to your list that are going to be really bad, and now they're going to be able to grow here because it's getting warmer and wetter. And that's like within the comfort zone of managers because they already have their watch list. So we're just saying add a couple species to the watch list, and then we help them think about when should they look for them, and then what should they do if they find them. But it's a good point, and it totally gets to the paper we just published in Nature Climate Change, like also thinking about strategically what things, should we be doing things qualitatively differently. But for the most part, it's been just like a shift in priorities.
Great, okay, thank you, Toni Lynn. We're going to switch to our last section here, which is trying to get a little feedback from you, our audience. And we're going to make an attempt to do an interactive session here using the chat and Darcy, could you fire up the there we go. So yeah, there we go. So here's how it'll work. I'm going to pose a question and ask for responses in the chat. And some of those, and I'm asking everyone to respond if possible. Once they stop rolling in, whoa, I'm going to ask anybody wants to say something verbally, and if so, just type the word comment, and I'll clear your microphone for that, and then we'll move on. But remember, this is all being recorded, and we're going to get these chat comments as well that we can compile and reflect them back to you. Everybody that signed up for this is going to get that kind of digest of the issues that came up. So I'm just we only have a few minutes here, so these are going to be fast. So go ahead, next. So given the survey results, the issues raised, and the work of the RISC that we just heard about from Toni Lynn, should we establish a dedicated group in Hawaii? Or you might call it a community of practice. So just say yes or no. Just on your chat, just start saying yes or no. As many people as can possibly respond. Seeing a lot of yeses, that's a good thing. Next. So if you, well, no, go back. So if you want to say something on that in whatever language, say the word comment. Otherwise, we'll move on to the next question. Okay, not seeing anything. Next. So what would you hope to gain by participating in this community of practice? And I'll give you a little more time since that's a little longer response. But please, everybody, if you could participate in that, that's good. So what would you hope to gain by participating? Some examples might be access to data, better interactions with researchers, maybe the availability to influence research, networking. I see some researchers thinking that they could get better access to managers. That's great. Okay, so just keep writing that in if you want. If you want to say something verbally, go ahead and write the word comment. These are great answers. Really appreciate this. Okay, it's kind of petered out here. If you're still typing, just keep going. It'll be recorded. So let's do the third question. So what would you like to see this group tackle first? We heard some examples and some needs in the survey. We heard a lot of ideas from our panel, and we heard some kind of how they got started notes from Toni Lynn. What do you think we should tackle first? And this might involve you as well, because you said you were interested. So, okay, so starting with JC, we're on the second or with the third question. More the merrier. Please put in an idea. It could be baby steps. It could be the big thing that we're all hoping to see. It could be anything at all. A lot of great answers here. And okay, if you want to say something verbally, go ahead and write the word comment. Got a couple more minutes, so please get your idea in there if you can. And because it sounds like this is a go, and we're going to want to get off the ground. So thanks, Yvonne. Thanks, Gordon. Okay, so now kind of the free for all. We do have time. We can go over the time. I know it's 1:59 right now. Thank you, Millie. If you want to actually kind of give your take on this whole thing and you want everybody to hear, now's the time you can actually unmute yourself, and if you feel, and put yourself on camera, and you can have your say. So feel free. If I don't get any takers, I'm going to close it off and toss it back to Heather. But if you want to say something now, go ahead.
Can I be heard?
Who's this? You can put yourself on screen too.
And can you hear me?
Yes, this is Jeff. Yes, go ahead.
Great, yeah, hello, this is Jeff Morissette. I'm with the National Invasive Species Council staff as the chief scientist for that. And I've been tracking what they're doing in the Northeast for quite a while. As it's been started, I find it very useful and exciting, the work that Toni and her group are doing. So just to sort of give a shot in the arm that the National Invasive Species Council, as we coordinate across various federal agencies with respect to invasive species, would be interested in staying in touch if this effort does proceed. The National Invasive Species Council was a collaborator with the Office of Hawaiian Affairs for the Ohia Challenge. We've been watching some of the USDA work on coconut rhinoceros beetle. USGS and its work with the brown tree snakes are all interesting invasive species issues that we've somewhat been working with folks on. So just to sort of say that this is exciting to see this, exciting to know about the work Paul Heimowitz and others are doing in the Northwest and the possible North Central initiative as well. So the National Invasive Species Council staff will be watching it and doing what we can to coordinate and cheer it on or do what we might be able to do from across the NIST agencies to help amplify and leverage the effort.
Really appreciate that, Jeff. Thank you very much. Anyone else want to have some thoughts? Okay, Heather, you want to take us home?
Sure. Thank you, everybody, so much for your participation and sticking through the whole webinar, and for all the panelists, and for Jeff, and for Toni Lynn and Laura Brewington. There's not much time, so I really just wanted to say thank you, and then to let you know that I will distribute a link to the recording and also any results that we have from that chat discussion and keep you informed through just the list of people that were on this call or had registered. It will come through as PyCast communications in case that was confusing at all. And if you don't want to be involved, just say so. Otherwise, we'll just see what we can do and share what information we have. So thank you so much for providing that great feedback at the end. Glad to know everyone was still paying attention and learned a lot. And organizers, feel free to chime in if you had anything else you wanted to add.
Big mahalo to our panel. Thanks very much, despite technical issues, and I think it worked great. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, everybody. Mahalo. Be well.